I bought burned land nobody wanted, rebuilt it from ash, 2 winters, every dollar I had. The day I hung my front door, she was already waiting, cease and desist in hand. 3 county complaints filed before I finished breakfast. She'd called my contractors personally, told them the land was under dispute. 2 walked off that afternoon. I hadn't broken a single law. She just didn't want a man with dirty work boots living next to her subdivision. What she didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that I had a deed from 1949. A document proving her entire neighborhood was built 11 feet onto my land. Every complaint she filed, every contractor she scared off, every lawyer's letter, she was digging her own grave, and I handed her the shovel. Have you ever had someone try to crush something you built from nothing? Drop where you're watching from. Let's back up because none of this makes sense without understanding where I started. My name's Decker Holloway. I'm 44 years old. I spent 22 years as a structural estimator for mid-size commercial contractors, and the one thing I always understood better than most people was the gap between what a building looks like and what it actually is. I could walk a half-constructed frame and tell you within 3% what the whole job would cost. Numbers, load-bearing walls, soil grades, that was my language. What I couldn't do, for most of my adult life, was afford land. Not real land. Not the kind you own outright. No HOA, no shared driveway easements, no monthly fee to a management company that sends you a citation because your mailbox is 2 inches too close to the curb. I grew up watching my father, a boilermaker named Earl Holloway, get nickel and dimed his entire life by people who wore khakis and carried clipboards. He worked every day of his life and never owned a single square foot of earth. That mattered to me in a way I can't fully explain except to say, owning land, free land, felt like proof that the life I was building meant something. So when I saw the listing in the fall of 2019, I almost drove off the road. 14 acres in the foothills east of Ridgecrest Pines, Oregon, heavily fire damaged. A 2017 wildfire had come through and taken the original structure, a single-family home built in 1953, down to the foundation slab and a few blackened chimney stones. The listing price was $47,000. The county assessed value, pre-fire, had been $310,000. I drove out on a cold Saturday morning. I remember the way the gravel crunched under my truck tires. That particular dry, hollow sound that only happens when the ground is just barely frosted, not quite frozen. The air smelled like old charcoal and pine resin, and something faintly mineral, the way soil smells when it's been soaked in ash for 2 years. I stood on that slab and I looked out at 14 acres of skeletal ponderosa pines, silver gray in the November light, and I thought, I can fix this. I bought it, paid cash. Every dollar of a retirement account I cashed out, penalty and all. My ex-wife thought I'd lost my mind. My brother Trent called it Earl's bad genetics acting up. I called it the best decision I'd ever made. Now, enter Renata Voss. Renata lived in Ridgecrest Pines proper, the HOA-governed subdivision that sat about a quarter mile down the main road from my parcel. She was the HOA board president, had been for 6 years, and the way the neighbors described her, she'd turned a fairly standard neighborhood association into something closer to a one-woman zoning commission. She had a gift for finding obscure ordinance language, a nose for property line disputes, and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for anything she hadn't personally approved. She was also, by the accounts of at least a dozen residents I'd later come to know, the reason 3 families had quietly sold and moved away in the previous 4 years. The first time I met her, I was parking my truck at the county recorder's office to file my deed. She was walking out as I was walking in, and she looked at me, looked at my Carhartt jacket, my work boots with dried concrete on the toe, the roll of survey documents under my arm, and she smiled, not warmly. "You must be the one who bought the burn site," she said. That was September of 2019. I didn't know it yet, but the war had already started. I want to be honest. I didn't take Renata seriously at first. That was my first mistake, and it cost me about 4 months of momentum. I spent the winter of 2019 doing what any structural estimator would do before a rebuild. I commissioned a full soil assessment, hired a surveyor named Gus Partridge, who'd been doing land surveys in that county for 31 years, and I started pulling permits for a single-family residence on the foundation slab. Standard stuff. The slab was in good shape, which surprised the building inspector who came out in January. He crouched down, knocked on the concrete with one gloved knuckle, and said, "Whoever poured this in '53 knew what they were doing." I took that as a sign. By February, I had framing lumber staged on site, a well driller scheduled for March, and a modest but solid plan. 1,800 square feet, one story, steel reinforced to meet current Oregon fire codes. I wasn't building a mansion. I was building a home I could live in, while eventually developing a small portion of the remaining acreage, maybe 3 or 4 rural lots, sell them to families who wanted space, fund my retirement properly this time. The first citation arrived on a Wednesday. It came by certified mail, on Ridgecrest Pines HOA letterhead. The letter, signed by Renata Voss, HOA president, informed me that my property fell within the Ridgecrest Pines buffer corridor, a zone defined in an HOA covenant amendment from 2014, and that any construction visible from the subdivision's perimeter required HOA design review approval before county permits could be acted upon. I read that 3 times. Now, here's the thing that any of you who've dealt with HOAs need to understand. An HOA can only govern property that was enrolled in the HOA's CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, at the time of either the HOA's formation or a valid subsequent annexation. My parcel had never been part of Ridgecrest Pines. It predated the subdivision by about 40 years. The buffer corridor amendment Renata cited was a 2014 HOA internal document that had 0 legal authority over land outside their jurisdiction. But here's the thing about legal authority versus practical nuisance. She didn't need to be right, she just needed to be loud. Within 48 hours of that letter, I received a call from my county permit office informing me that a formal complaint had been filed with the county planning department, alleging that my building permits had been issued in error and that construction should be halted pending review. The county planner, a stressed, overworked guy named Doug, who sounded like he hadn't slept since 2017, told me it would take 4 to 6 weeks to resolve. 4 to 6 weeks of lumber sitting in the Oregon winter. 4 to 6 weeks of contractor scheduling falling apart. My framing crew had another job lined up. I lost them. My well driller rescheduled me 3 months out. I drove to the HOA's management office, a small suite above a real estate office in downtown Ridgecrest Pines, and I asked to speak with Renata directly. The receptionist, a nervous young woman who wouldn't make eye contact, told me Renata was unavailable. I left my card. Renata never called. What she did instead was file a second complaint. This one alleged that my debris removal, I'd been hauling out burned timber and ash in a rented dump truck, constituted unpermitted excavation within a designated watershed buffer zone. The smell of that hauled ash, by the way, is something I'll never forget. Cold, alkaline, faintly sweet in a way that felt wrong, like the memory of a forest that didn't exist anymore. I called an attorney. Her name was Fiona Stroud, a real property litigator out of Medford, who'd spent 15 years untangling HOA overreach cases, and who had, in her own words, made a reasonable living off the hubris of subdivision governance boards. She reviewed the HOA covenant, the buffer corridor amendment, and my deed, took one yellow highlighter pass through the documents, and then looked at me over her reading glasses. "This is paper aggression," she said. "She can't win any of this. But she's betting you don't know that, and she's betting the county responds to complaints first and asks questions later. So what do? You respond to everything. In writing, every single complaint, you counter with a written legal response, documented, filed with the county. You make the paper trail so thick and so clear that when this finally lands in front of a judge, the case writes itself. I asked how long that would take. Fiona smiled, and it was not a comforting smile. That depends on how patient she is. As it turned out, patience was not Renata Voss's strongest attribute. Spring arrived and the battle shifted terrain. My attorney Fiona had fired back a 12-page legal response to the county planning department, citing the parcel's independent title history dating to 1947, the specific statutory language governing HOA jurisdictional reach under Oregon Revised Statutes Chapter 94, and a politely devastating footnote pointing out that the HOA's 2014 Buffer Corridor Amendment had never been recorded with the county at all, meaning it was, legally speaking, roughly as binding as a strongly worded post-it note. The county cleared my permits in 11 days, not 4 to 6 weeks, 11 days. I'd like to tell you Renata took that gracefully. I'd like to tell you she recalibrated and decided to be a reasonable human being. Instead, she showed up at my property line. Not trespassing, she was careful about that. She stood on the shoulder of the access road, in a fleece vest and hiking boots, with a camera, photographing every truck that came and went. My lumber delivery, my concrete mixer, my septic contractor. She was building what she apparently believed was a documentation record, though what she intended to do with photos of legal permitted construction on private land remained somewhat unclear, even in retrospect. What it did do was rattle my contractors. 2 of them called me separately to ask if there was some kind of dispute with the property. One, a plumber named Walt, who'd been in the trade for 25 years and had seen everything, just laughed when I explained it. "Oh, a clipboard lady," he said. "I've worked 3 jobs where one of those slowed things down. You gotta outlast them." He showed up every scheduled day, on time, and waved cheerfully at Renata each morning. I appreciated Walt. The escalation came in May. I've been making quiet progress. Foundation repairs complete, framing going up, the basic skeleton of the house visible above the tree line for the first time. And then I received a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a law firm in Portland. Hartwell and Crane, LLC, specializing in property and land use. The letter informed me that Ridgecrest Pines HOA was asserting a prescriptive easement claim over a 30-foot strip along my western boundary. Prescriptive easement. Let me break that down, because this is one of those legal maneuvers that sounds impressive until you understand what it actually requires. A prescriptive easement claim, in Oregon and most states, requires the claimant to prove that they used a portion of someone else's property openly, continuously, and without permission for a statutory period. In Oregon, that period is 10 years. The HOA was claiming that their residents had used a trail along my western edge for over a decade, and had therefore acquired a legal right to continue doing so. Now, my property had been uninhabitable since the 2017 fire. Before that, it had been owned by a retired couple named the Birches, who had, I later confirmed, explicitly no knowledge of any trail usage, and had certainly never given permission for it. The fire had destroyed any physical evidence of a trail, and the HOA's own maintenance records, which Fiona obtained through a public records request to the county, showed no maintenance, no documentation, no recorded use of any such trail at any point. The prescriptive easement claim was, in Fiona's words, a fishing expedition dressed up in a sport coat. But here's where Renata made her most significant tactical error, and I need you to pay attention to this part. In pressing the easement claim, Hartwell and Crane had to file legal documents that described the boundaries of the disputed strip in precise terms. To do that, they referenced the HOA's own survey records, and in those survey records, records that Renata had presumably never personally reviewed in detail, was a notation I hadn't seen before. Gus Partridge, my surveyor, caught it first. He called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear him trying to contain something in his voice. Not quite excitement, more like the particular professional satisfaction of a man who spent 31 years reading land records and just found a typo that changes everything. "Decker," he said, "I think you need to come look at something." I drove out to his office the next morning. He had a survey map spread across his drafting table, 2 different plats overlaid in different colors, and a magnifying glass sitting on top like we were solving a mystery at a Victorian gentleman's club. We were. "See this line?" He tapped a boundary marker notation on the 1987 subdivision plat, the original Ridgecrest Pines Development Survey. "According to this, their western boundary ends here." He moved his finger 2 inches to the right on the map. But according to their own prescriptive easement filing, they're claiming a strip that starts here. I looked at him. That's inside their own boundary. 15 feet inside their own boundary. He leaned back and crossed his arms. They're claiming an easement on land they already own. And in doing so, they've drawn a survey line that inadvertently confirms where their property ends and where yours begins. Clean. The smell of old blueprints and coffee in that drafting room is a scent I associate, permanently and happily, with the moment the tide turned. Now I had something. Not the full weapon yet. That was coming. But I had a thread, and the thing about threads is that if you're patient and deliberate, you can follow them all the way to the seam. Fiona filed a formal response to the prescriptive easement claim that did two things simultaneously. It contested the easement on its legal merits, and it introduced the survey discrepancy into the record. Professionally, cleanly, without fanfare. We weren't showing our hand, we were just making sure the hand was documented. Renata's attorneys at Hartwell and Crane went quiet for about 3 weeks, which Fiona said was either a good sign or a sign they were regrouping. As it turned out, it was the latter. By July, I had the exterior of the house framed, sheathed, and under roof. Standing at the edge of my property in the late afternoon, the dry, resiny smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with the cooler air coming off the hills, and looking at a structure I'd built on land I'd paid for from absolute ruin, there was a feeling I'm not sure I can fully articulate. Not pride exactly. Something more physical than that. Like the ground was solid under my feet in a way it hadn't been for years. Then the county code enforcement officer showed up. His name was Barrett Quinn, and he was, by every account, a decent and somewhat exhausted civil servant who clearly did not enjoy making this particular visit. He stood at the base of my porch steps with a printed complaint form and explained that an anonymous complaint had alleged my construction was in violation of the Ridgecrest Pines corridor setback requirements, and that I was within 3 feet of a protected riparian buffer. There was no riparian buffer. The nearest creek was 900 feet from my structure. I had the soil assessment, the county GIS maps, and the approved building plans, all showing this clearly. Barrett Quinn, to his credit, took one look at my documentation and said, with the exhausted candor of a man who files a lot of paperwork for other people's arguments, "This is going to come back no violation, but I have to log it." "Who filed the complaint?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Anonymous." "Right." This is where I want to talk about something practical, because I know some of you watching have dealt with exactly this kind of coordinated harassment. And that's what it was, regardless of the legal window dressing. The strategy Renata was using has a name in legal circles: vexatious litigation. It's the use of technically legal but frivolous complaints and filings as a weapon of attrition. You can't be held liable for filing a complaint. So you file complaint after complaint, each one costing your opponent time, money, and momentum, hoping they'll give up before you run out of tricks. The defense against vexatious litigation is documentation and patience. Every complaint I received, I filed a response with the county. Every response referenced a specific statute or recorded document. I built a binder, a physical 3-ring binder, color-tabbed, indexed, that by August contained 47 documents and was nearly 3 inches thick. My brother Trent came to visit in August, picked it up off the kitchen table and said, with genuine admiration, "Brother, you have become a man with a binder." I'm choosing to take that as a compliment. But Renata wasn't done. In August, she went to the Ridgecrest Pines HOA membership and presented what she called a community impact assessment, a document she'd apparently commissioned herself, alleging that my development plans would increase traffic, decrease property values, and disturb wildlife corridors. She used this to push through an HOA board resolution, formally opposing my development and authorizing continued legal action. What she didn't account for was that 4 of the 7 HOA board members had grown quietly, deeply tired of her. I know this because 2 of them called me. I want to be clear, they called me. I hadn't reached out to anyone on the board. But word travels in small communities, and the story of the man who'd bought the burn site and was fighting Renata Voss through pure paperwork competence had, apparently, achieved some local notoriety. One board member, a retired contractor named Harlan Bussey, introduced himself on the phone as someone who's been waiting for this particular conversation for about 3 years. "She's been doing this to people for a long time," Harlan said. "The families who sold and left, 2 of them left because of exactly this. Not legal issues, just her, grinding them down." "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to watch her lose cleanly," he said. "And I think you might be the person who does it." I told him I'd be in touch. The game had just changed shape. Gus Partridge called me again in early September, and this time there was no professional containment in his voice at all. "I've been going through the original title chain on your parcel," he said, "all the way back, And Decker, there's something here you need to see in person. I drove to his office. He had the drafting table cleared and replaced with a sequence of county recorder documents, laid out in chronological order, oldest to newest. Original plat, 1947. Deed of transfer, 1953. Another transfer, 1978. The Birch family purchase, 1991. My purchase, 2019. A clean, unbroken chain. But there was a document between the 1947 plat and the 1953 deed that I'd never looked at closely, because there was no obvious reason to. It was a recorded easement agreement from 1949, the original landowner granting a utility easement to the county for overhead power lines. That wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was the legal description in that 1949 document. Because in 1949, when the county drafted that easement, they described the parcel boundaries in precise meets and bounds language. And those boundaries, the exact corner coordinates described in 1949, were 11 feet wider on the western edge than what Ridgecrest Pines' own 1987 subdivision plat showed. 11 feet. Over the full length of the parcel, roughly 800 linear feet, that was about a quarter of an acre. Gus laid a ruler across the two documents. When the subdivision was platted in '87, somebody made an error in the boundary survey, off by about 11 feet. The subdivision's western boundary was drawn 11 feet too far east, which means 11 feet of what they've been calling their property since 1987 technically belongs to your chain of title. I sat down. Let me be clear, Gus continued, in the careful voice of a man who's very aware of what he's saying. This has never been adjudicated. It would require a quiet title action to legally establish. But the 1949 recorded document predates the subdivision plat by 38 years, and recorded documents establish priority. A quiet title action is a legal proceeding used to establish clear ownership of a disputed property boundary. You file in circuit court, the judge reviews the chain of title, and issues a ruling that, literally, quiets any competing claims. It's not fast, it's not cheap, but it is, once completed, final. Takeaway. A recorded document from before a later survey error will almost always take legal precedence. And if you've got a 1949 county recorded boundary description, that is a very solid foundation for a quiet title claim. Here's the part that truly mattered, though. That 11-foot strip? The HOA's primary access road. The private road maintained by the HOA budget and used by all 84 households in Ridgecrest Pines, crossed the corner of my parcel by approximately 4 feet. Their road. My land. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside Gus's window, a couple of starlings were arguing over a wire, and somewhere down the street, someone was running a leaf blower with the particular mechanical whine that says fall is here and nothing is simple. I called Fiona. She listened to the full explanation without interrupting. Then, this is not something we lead with. This is something we hold. You understand the difference? It's the deed, I said. It's the nuclear option, she said, and we only get to use it once. The next 6 weeks were the quietest of the entire conflict, which is sometimes how it goes when you're actually preparing to win. I want to walk you through what we built, legally, structurally, and socially, because this is the part of the story where the how matters as much as the what. First, the quiet title action. Fiona prepared the filing but held it. The strategy was sequencing. You don't file your strongest card while the opponent is still in mid-bluff. We needed Renata to make one more significant move, something that would be on record as the proximate cause of the escalation, before we dropped the deed challenge into the proceedings. A judge looking at a case appreciates context. They filed first, they escalated, and then the underlying property dispute became unavoidable. That's a much cleaner narrative than a preemptive strike. Second, Harlan Boosie began quietly working within the HOA board. He didn't need to convert a majority, he needed to document what was happening. He started keeping his own records of HOA board meetings, noting specifically when actions were taken without proper member notice or vote, and when expenditures were authorized for legal fees without the full membership's knowledge. Oregon's Planned Community Act, ORS Chapter 94, requires HOAs to disclose major expenditures to members and to conduct certain votes by member referendum. If an HOA spends significant money on litigation without proper member authorization, that's a governance violation. Fiona flagged this for later use. Legal financial accountability of HOA boards is something most homeowners don't know they can invoke, but it's real and it has teeth. Third, I started talking to my neighbors, not the HOA members, the surrounding rural landowners, the people in the broader community outside the subdivision. 3 of them had their own minor boundary grievances with Ridgecrest Pines going back years. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of low-grade property tension that accumulates when an HOA behaves as if its jurisdiction is wherever it points. 2 of them had received strongly worded letters from Renata's board about encroachment on the buffer corridor. None of them had ever pursued it because they didn't think they had standing. They did, and they were willing to say so publicly. Fourth, and this is the part my brother Trent called diabolically wholesome, I formally applied for a permit to build a rural community access road on the eastern portion of my property, connecting 2 dead-end rural roads that had no through access. This was completely legal, completely legitimate, and would cost me about $18,000 in grading and gravel. It would also be, once built, a genuine public benefit. Emergency vehicle access to 3 rural properties that currently had only 1 exit road each. More importantly, it required a county public hearing. A county public hearing is a matter of public record, announced in the local paper, open to testimony from community members. It would put my project, and by extension, the HOA dispute, in front of a county commissioner and on the public record, with press potentially in attendance. Fiona identified this as the ideal venue for the final confrontation. Not a courtroom, which takes years and happens in relative obscurity. A public hearing, which happens fast and happens in daylight. I submitted the road permit application in October. The hearing was scheduled for late November. In the meantime, I hired a licensed title researcher, not Gus, a separate firm, Caldwell Title Services out of Portland, to produce an independent chain of title report on my parcel. Clean, third-party, professional. This report, when complete, would include the 1949 boundary description and its implications. I paid $2,200 for it. It would become the most valuable $2,200 I ever spent. Fiona also sent a carefully worded letter to Hartwell and Crane, Renata's attorneys, noting that we had identified material discrepancies in the recorded boundary history of properties adjacent to their client's community, and that we were in the process of completing a title review before determining next steps. Not a threat, not a revelation, just a signal. Lawyers understand signals. Hartwell and Crane went very quiet. The house itself was coming together during all this. By late October, I had drywall in, windows in, a wood stove connected. The first morning I made coffee inside the structure, standing at what would be the kitchen window, the low November light coming through the pines, the faint smell of fresh drywall and pine pitch and propane, the particular silence of a space that's been empty for years and is just beginning to feel occupied. It felt like something more than a building project. It felt like the specific satisfaction of proving something true by existing inside the proof. I had 14 acres, a house, a 3-inch binder, a title researcher, a property litigator, a retired contractor named Harlan, and a 1949 deed. Renata had a camera and a law firm that had gone quiet. November was going to be interesting. She didn't wait for November. In late October, I received notification that the HOA had filed an injunction request in Lane County Circuit Court to halt my road permit application pending resolution of the easement dispute. The argument, constructed carefully by Hartwell and Crane, was that the proposed access road would pass through the disputed buffer corridor, and that proceeding with the public hearing before the easement question was resolved was legally premature. It was a smart move. Not winning, but smart. The goal wasn't to win the injunction. The goal was to delay the public hearing, buy time, and keep the confrontation out of daylight for as long as possible. The judge assigned to the injunction request denied it in 6 days. 6 days. Fiona told me later that the judge, a no-nonsense circuit court veteran named Judge Marin Calloway, had written a 1-page denial that essentially said the HOA had not demonstrated standing to block a county public hearing on a separate private parcel's development, and that the easement dispute, if valid, could be addressed through proper channels independent of the hearing. Renata apparently received this news poorly. What happened next came through Harlan, my inside contact on the HOA board. He called me the first week of November to tell me that Renata had convened an emergency board meeting without proper member notice, which was itself an ORS Chapter 94 violation, which Harlan duly documented, and had proposed using HOA reserve funds to hire a private investigator to compile a community impact dossier on me personally. I want to dwell on this for a moment, because it is genuinely instructive about how petty power operates when it starts to feel the walls closing in. She wasn't trying to find anything specific. She was fishing. The theory, presumably, was that if you look hard enough at anyone, you find something embarrassing, something that can be used to discredit them in a public forum. A DUI from years ago, a business dispute, a messy divorce. The intent wasn't evidence, it was noise, deployed strategically to muddy the waters before the public hearing. The board voted 5-2 against authorizing the expenditure. Harlan voted no. The motion failed. Renata authorized it anyway, out of her own pocket. I found this out because the private investigator she hired was a semi-retired former insurance claims investigator named Dale Sutter, who drove a very noticeable burgundy Chevy Impala, and who, within 72 hours of beginning his surveillance, had been politely and curiously inquired about by 4 different rural neighbors, 3 of whom took photos of his license plate, and one of whom, Walt, my plumber, who apparently lives nearby, knocked on his window and asked him point-blank what he was doing. Dale, to his credit, was apparently not comfortable with this particular assignment. He called my attorney's office, not me, Fiona's office, and offered to provide a written statement about who had hired him and what the scope of the inquiry was, in exchange for not being named in any subsequent litigation. Fiona accepted, professionally and without joy. Dale's statement was notarized and filed. What Dale had found, by the way, nothing. I have a speeding ticket from 2011 and a minor dispute with a subcontractor from 2016 that was resolved out of court with no finding against me. That's it. I live a remarkably unglamorous life outside of property disputes. There was also a social media campaign. 3 anonymous accounts on 2 platforms began posting vague, negative commentary about my road project, framing it as an industrial development that would bring trucks and noise and environmental damage to a quiet rural area. The posts were shared almost exclusively within a private Ridgecrest Pines Facebook group. 2 of the accounts were created within 72 hours of each other, in October, and had no prior posting history. One of them used a profile picture that reverse image search identified as a stock photo of a Labrador retriever. I'm not saying Renata ran sock puppet accounts. I'm saying that 3 brand new anonymous accounts with no history suddenly appeared to attack my project the week the injunction failed, and one of them was a stock photo dog, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions. We documented all of it, screenshot by screenshot, timestamp by timestamp. Harlan documented the unauthorized board meeting. Fiona documented Dale's statement. I documented the social media accounts. I added a 4th tab to the binder and ran out of room, so I got a second binder. The public hearing was 3 weeks out. Outside my window, the first hard frost of November had turned the old burn site grass silver white, and the skeleton pines were dusted with it, and the whole property looked clean and cold, and like something in the process of becoming what it was always meant to be. I slept well that night, better than I had in months. The final week before the public hearing, Renata made the move I'd been half expecting and half hoping for. She went to the county planning department directly and requested that the hearing be re-noticed, rescheduled, on the basis that the public notice advertisement had failed to properly describe the scope of the proposed road project. It was procedurally thin. The notice had been published correctly, but county planning departments are cautious animals, and a formal rescheduling request from an HOA with legal representation on file triggered a review process. The planning director called me on a Thursday to tell me the hearing might be pushed 2 weeks. I asked the planning director one question. Has the current notice been found to be procedurally deficient? Pause. Not as yet. Then I'd respectfully request that you proceed as scheduled and document the rescheduling request as filed. Another pause. That's your right, yes. He proceeded. The hearing stayed, and Renata's rescheduling request went into the county file. Dated, documented, one more data point in the picture of coordinated interference. That same week, Fiona filed the quiet title action in circuit court. She timed it deliberately. The quiet title filing became public record the Monday before the Thursday public hearing. It was published in the county legal notices, the same legal notices where the hearing announcement had run, and it described in precise legal language the 1949 recorded boundary description, the 1987 survey discrepancy, and the fact that a portion of the Ridgecrest Pines Common Access Road crossed into the title chain of my property. I was not present when Hartwell and Crane received this filing. I would have liked to have been. From Harlan's account, he'd become by this point a reliable and slightly delighted intelligence source. The news hit the Ridgecrest Pines board like a cold bucket of water. Because here's what the members of that HOA suddenly had to reckon with. If the quiet title action succeeded, their private access road, the road 84 households used every single day to enter and exit the subdivision, ran across land that belonged to me. Not a theoretical easement dispute, an actual property overlap. This wasn't about buffer corridors anymore. This was about whether every homeowner in Ridgecrest Pines could get their car in and out of their driveway. Board member calls to Harlan increased significantly. Meanwhile, I was doing something that, to outside observers, probably looked either very confident or slightly unhinged. I was finishing my house. The Thursday morning of the hearing, I hung the last interior door, connected the range hood, and swept the kitchen floor. Not because I needed to have it done before the hearing, but because I wanted the sequence to feel right. This house existed. It was finished. Whatever happened that afternoon, the land was inhabited, and the building was real, and nothing Renata Voss filed in any court could change what I had built with my own hands, from 14 acres of ash and bone-cold Oregon soil. I put on a clean flannel shirt and drove to the county building. I should tell you what I found when I arrived. The public hearing for a rural road permit in a sparsely populated county on a Thursday afternoon in November is not typically a high-attendance event. There's usually a planner, a commissioner, maybe a handful of affected neighbors, and occasionally someone's elderly relative who wandered in by accident. This hearing had 43 people in attendance. I counted. Harlan was there, with 5 HOA board members. 3 of the rural landowners I'd spoken to were there. Walt the plumber was there, in a clean jacket that I'm fairly certain he'd purchased for the occasion. 2 reporters from local papers, the County Weekly and a regional daily out of Medford, were there with notebooks, because apparently the quiet title filing had attracted attention. And a woman from the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development was there, because she'd seen the county file and found the boundary dispute professionally interesting. Renata Voss was there, at the front of the public seating, in a dark blazer, her attorney beside her, a folder of documents on her lap. She saw me come in. Our eyes met for exactly 1 second. She looked like a person who had just realized that the game she thought she was playing was not, in fact, the game that had been happening. I took a seat near the back. Fiona sat beside me. My second binder was in my bag. Caldwell Title's independent report was in the binder. The 1949 recorded document was in the report, and somewhere in that room was the full, documented history of every complaint, every filing, every anonymous social media account, every cease and desist, every survey discrepancy, all of it dated, all of it cross-referenced, all of it pointing in one direction. The commissioner called the hearing to order. Public hearings follow a structure, and the structure is both mundane and, in this instance, merciless. The planning director opened by summarizing the road permit application: scope, location, traffic impact, emergency access benefit. Standard stuff. He noted, neutrally, that a related boundary dispute was pending in circuit court, and that the hearing's scope was limited to the road permit itself. Fiona had anticipated this framing and prepared accordingly. The commission invited public comment. Renata's attorney, a precise man named Gerald Crane, who I'll give credit for being a genuinely skilled litigator operating with a weak hand, stood first. He presented the HOA's opposition: road traffic, environmental impact, the pending easement dispute, the general inappropriateness of proceeding while litigation was active. It was well organized, professionally delivered, and fundamentally beside the point, because everything he described was speculative impact, and none of it pertained to the road permit's legal merits. When he finished, I noticed something. He did not mention the quiet title action directly. He mentioned boundary concerns, obliquely. He was, I realized, hoping the commissioners hadn't read the actual filing. The two reporters had. I could see one of them underlining something in his notebook. Fiona stood for my side. She was brief, intentionally, surgically brief. She presented the road permit application on its merits, the emergency access benefit for 3 rural properties, the DLCD representative's written statement of support, and the legal opinion that the pending boundary dispute had no bearing on the permit application. 4 minutes. She sat down. Then, Harlan Bussey stood up. He was not there as my advocate, technically. He was there as an HOA board member, which meant his testimony was internal opposition, a board member publicly contradicting the board's official position. He explained, in the plain language of a man who spent 30 years in construction and has no patience for political theater, that the HOA's legal campaign against my property had been conducted largely without proper member authorization, that reserve funds had been discussed for use in the litigation without required member vote, and that he had documentation of a board meeting convened without proper notice. Gerald Crane objected to a public hearing, which is not a courtroom, and the commissioner told him, not unkindly, that this was public comment, and everyone who signed up got to speak. 3 rural landowners testified briefly about the emergency access benefit of the road. 2 of them mentioned, in passing, that they'd received HOA letters about their own properties in the last 5 years, that they now understood to have had no legal basis. The DLCD representative, a calm, precise woman who clearly had done her homework, noted that her department had reviewed the title history on the road permit application and had flagged a recorded boundary discrepancy from 1949 that may require resolution at the county assessor level, independent of this proceeding. That was the moment. Not dramatic, quiet, technical, official, but every person in that room who understood what it meant, and there were about 15 of them, sat up slightly straighter. The commissioner turned to Renata directly. Ms. Voss, would you like to address the board's internal governance concerns raised in prior testimony? Renata stood, and I will give her this. She was composed. She was articulate. She presented a version of events in which she was a diligent community steward, protecting property values and neighborhood character from incompatible development. But she had to do it in a room with 2 reporters, a DLCD official, a circuit court filing on the public record, and a notarized statement from her own private investigator in my attorney's bag. Fiona stood when Renata finished. Commissioner, with your permission, I'd like to submit to the record Caldwell Title Services' independent chain of title analysis for parcel 37-1904, completed October 28th of this year, along with the concurrent quiet title filing in Lane County Circuit Court, case number 23-CV-4471. She set both documents on the table. These materials establish, through independent third-party analysis, that a recorded 1949 county easement document predates and supersedes a boundary survey error in the 1987 Ridgecrest Pines subdivision plat, and that a 4-foot section of the subdivision's primary access road falls within my client's title chain. She paused, not dramatically, just the natural pause of a person who's finished saying a precise and important thing. My client's position is that the pending road permit application should be approved on its merits, which it clearly satisfies. The boundary matter will be resolved in circuit court. We simply ask that the record reflect the full title history of these parcels. She sat down. The room was the particular quiet of people processing information they'd been handed without expectation. Gerald Crane leaned over and said something to Renata. She did not respond. She was looking at the title report on the commissioner's table with an expression I have no desire to describe unkindly, but which I will describe accurately. It was the expression of a person who has spent 4 years playing a power game on a board she thought she owned, and has just discovered that the board was always bigger than she knew. The commissioner approved the road permit unanimously, 14 minutes later. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the cold November air that smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere in the hills, Walt the plumber shook my hand and said, "Same time next year?" I told him I sincerely hoped not. The quiet title action settled 8 months later, in July of the following year, without going to full trial. Hartwell and Crane, facing an independent title report, a documented survey error, a 1949 recorded boundary description, and a circuit court judge who had already demonstrated she read her filings carefully, recommended settlement. The HOA membership, not Renata, the actual membership, who by this point had received Harlan's governance documentation and were asking pointed questions at board meetings, voted to authorize a negotiated resolution. The settlement did three things. First, it formally established my western boundary per the 1949 recorded description, adding approximately a quarter acre to my recorded parcel. Second, it granted the HOA a permanent recorded easement over the 4-foot road overlap, in exchange for a lump sum payment to me of $22,500, fair market value for a permanent road easement over that footage, assessed by a neutral appraiser. Third, it required the HOA to cover my attorney's fees for the prescriptive easement defense, which came to $14,800. Total financial outcome: I recovered $37,300 clear against an initial property investment of $47,000, plus a house, plus 14 acres, plus a road. Renata Voss did not run for re-election as HOA board president. She did not announce this decision publicly. Her term simply ended, and she did not file to continue it. Harlan Bussey ran instead, on a governance reform platform, mandatory member notification, reserve fund transparency, annual independent audits. He won, 6-1. The one vote against him was reportedly Renata's. The HOA's annual fees dropped by $340 per household in the first year under Harlan's board, primarily because they stopped authorizing legal action against people outside their jurisdiction. 3 of the families who'd previously sold and left the area, the ones who'd been ground down by exactly the process I'd survived, I can't give them their homes back. But I've spoken to one of them since, a retired teacher named Yvonne Marsh, who sold her adjacent rural property in 2021 after a relentless campaign of code complaints and legal threats she couldn't afford to fight. She listened to the whole story and said, with a quiet that was something between grief and relief, "I just needed to know it was possible." As for the land itself, 14 acres, rebuilt. The access road went in on schedule in early spring, gravel and drainage done right. Exactly what 3 rural families needed and had never had. The emergency access benefit became real within 4 months of completion, when a grass fire started east of the property, and the fire department used that road for staging. One of the fire captains sent me a handwritten note. I framed it. It's on the wall. On the eastern 5 acres, the portion I'd always intended for eventual development, I changed my plans. Instead of subdividing into individual lots, I partnered with a local conservation land trust to establish a permanent conservation easement on 3 acres of restored riparian habitat along a seasonal creek, with a small public trailhead access point at the road. The remaining 2 acres I did eventually develop. One additional rural home site sold to a family with 3 kids who wanted space and a vegetable garden and quiet. With a portion of the settlement proceeds and the lot sale revenue, I established a small annual scholarship at the regional community college, $2,500 per year, targeted at students in construction trades programs. Not enough to change a life by itself, enough to change a semester. Earl Holloway, boilermaker, never owned a square foot of earth. His son does. The scholarship is in his name. I finished the story the way I built the house, one piece at a time, each piece connected to the one before it, until the whole thing stands.
So that's where it ended. Renata walked into that hearing room thinking she held every card. She walked out with a county commissioner, 2 reporters, and her own neighbors watching her get dismantled by a deep older than her entire neighborhood. Here's what I want you to take from Decker's story. He didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he did one thing Renata never expected from a man in dirty work boots. He understood the paperwork better than she did. Every complaint she filed, he answered in writing. Every legal threat, he must with a record document. While she was hiring private investigators and running anonymous social media accounts, he was quietly following a 1949 survey line on the way to the truth. She mistook his silence for weakness. That was the whole game. Right now, someone watching this is sitting at their kitchen table with an HOA letter in their hand thinking, I can't fight this. You have more than you think. Your deed is a weapon. Your county recorder's office is free, and documented patients beats emotional reaction every single time. What's the most outrageous thing a petty authority has ever put on you? Drop it in the comments. Every story down there is someone realizing they're not alone. If this one hit home, subscribe, because next time a HOA tried to force close on a veteran's house over $180 in unpaid fines. Same playbook, different victim, until he wasn't. The land was always his. The deed just finally got to speak.